When my son Daniel first asked me to take him camping, I was a bit surprised. Until then, he had never really shown any interest in such things. It caught me off guard so much, I jokingly accused him of being an alien. After a moment of laughter, he told me the reason of his sudden interest. He said that his good friend Peter had just returned from a camping trip with his dad and had been telling him about all the fun they had. As I listened to this recounting, I could feel my fatherly instincts beginning to boil. There was nothing on my mind aside from destroying Peter and his dad at their own game. I smiled at Daniel and told him that I would take him camping as soon as I got some free time off of work. A few weeks had gone by, and I had taken some time off from my job. During my off hours leading up to the mini vacation, I did my best to research all there was to know about camping. I had only gone camping a couple of times as a child, so all the activities involved had been lost on me. There was no way I would let Daniel, or God forbid, Peter, find out. However, during all this, my wife Laura decided to just take a step back and not get involved in our little excursion. I called her a coward for not committing herself to the destruction of Peter's family, but that did little to change her stance on the matter. Eventually, the weekend arrived. That Friday, I picked up Daniel from school and took him home. When we entered through the front door, I watched his eyes light up at all the supplies. I had organized a large tent bag, which rested at his feet. Some sleeping bags leaned against the table, and bags of rations, mostly s'mores and snacks, sat near two fully loaded backpacks. I asked Daniel if he was ready to brave the wilderness with me, and he nodded with a stern resolve. Once we loaded up the car, Laura told me with sincerity to be careful. While I often like to joke about situations, I promised her everything would be fine. Daniel and I both hopped into the car, and off we went. During my research, I had found a couple of locations to camp at. Daniel had told me earlier that Peter and his dad went camping at the lakeside campgrounds, which were the closest to our town. I scoffed at such an obvious location, as if I were some campground expert. Our location would be in a forest, nearly 2 hours north of our town. After answering what felt like millions of questions and playing I Spy until images began to blur, we arrived, thankfully. We pulled off the road onto a winding stretch of coarse dirt that snaked its way through the trees. Our car bounced and rattled the entire time. Another 20 minutes or so passed before we encountered a clearing. We parked the car off to the side, and Daniel looked at me expectantly. I asked him if he was ready, to which he nodded excitedly. We both stepped out of the car, retrieved our backpacks, and hoisted the tent onto our shoulders. We walked a few meters away from the car and began to set up our campsite. After fumbling with the instructions when Daniel wasn't looking, I somehow managed to erect the tent, but despite my best efforts, it still had a slant on one side. We laid our sleeping bags in the tent, and I told Daniel to find some sticks to get a fire going. While he was off scrounging for kindling, I skirted the tree line for any loose logs I can use. With our resources acquired, I began the tedious process of starting a fire from scratch. After nearly 20 minutes of failing, I walked over to my car and reluctantly retrieved a lighter. Within a few seconds, the dry brush caught the flame, and a few minutes later, we had a roaring campfire. I took a moment to appreciate the technology before I called Daniel over. We sat together, making s'mores underneath the changing sky as the sun was beginning its descent. Around an hour after dusk, I told Daniel it was time to sleep, and with a yawn, he nodded. As I tapped the smoldering flame with my boot a few times, the embers began to die out, and we began to climb into the tent into our sleeping bags. Daniel and I began to listen to the sounds of the forest around us, the chirping of the crickets, the slight rustling of the leaves in the wind, and the distant howl of some sort of coyote. Before I knew it, my eyelids had shut, and I had drifted off. My slumber seemed to only last a few seconds when I felt something nudging my shoulder. I cracked open my tired eyes and looked around. Daniel was sitting next to me, staring at me in the dark. I asked him what was wrong, He told me that he heard a noise outside of the tent. With my exhaustion getting the better of me, I told him it was probably an animal and just to go back to sleep. As I rolled over to my side and waited for sleep to take me once again, I heard it. It sounded like footsteps, 2 footsteps walking around our camp. If it were some type of animal, there would have been some sort of distinction or rhythm to it, but there wasn't. It sounded like a person walking around. They would take 2 steps, then stop. A minute or 2 would pass before I would hear them walk again. I rubbed my tired eyes and sat up into my sleeping bag. Daniel was lying next to me, but very much awake. With a whisper, I told him I would take a peek outside to make sure there was nothing there. He responded with a slight nod, and I leaned forward. I quietly tugged at the small zipper and peeled it away slowly. With the tent slightly opened, I peeked out, looking around. With how dark it was outside and the long extinguished campfire, it was nearly impossible to see anything of note. Still, I scanned around carefully, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever had been making that noise. I thought I spotted something moving near the trees, but after blinking my eyes, it was gone. I turned back to Daniel, who was now sitting up and looking at me quietly. I told him there was nothing to worry about and that we should go back to sleep. As we both laid back down, I heard something that made my hair stand on end. The snapping of a twig directly on the other side of the tent, where our heads were resting. I quietly sat back up and retrieved my flashlight from my bag. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and crawled outside. Standing up outside the tent, I felt a chill from the cold night air wrapped around me. Before focusing on my goal, I turned on my flashlight and the beam of light punctured the darkness, and at first, I saw nothing of note, just the grass and the outline of the trees in the distance. Then, it stood up on the other side of the tent. This figure towered above our small tent, and despite me looking directly at it, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was human-like in appearance, with limbs longer than its torso jutting out from the shoulders and hips. Its skin seemed smooth, though it was hard to tell with the amount of dirt covering its body. Its head was nightmarish and massive. It had huge eyes that were set deep into its skull. The eyes themselves were black, but when I shined my light on them, those eyes would reflect back at me, and its mouth seemed to stretch across the entirety of its face like an exaggerated grin. My flashlight shook rapidly in my hand, and I was shivering once again, but this time not from the cold. After a moment passed, I heard a noise that made my heart sink into my stomach. Daniel called out to me, asking if I could see anything. When his tiny voice carried out from that tent, this thing before me twitched, turned its attention to my son's voice, who was still inside my tent. It seemed like it was drawn to the sound of my son's voice. Its face angled down towards the nylon material. Its smiling mouth began to widen. Then its lower jaw dropped to nearly a foot long. A row of thin, razor-sharp teeth lined the top and bottom of its mouth. It raised its unnaturally long arms high up into the air. And then I realized what it was going to do. My body reacted on its own, and I reached inside the tent, grabbing Daniel, pulling as hard as I could. As we came crashing on the ground, this thing assaulted and tore through our tent. Both in shock, I helped Daniel by placing my hand on his mouth as I felt his tears drip down my skin. We stared as this thing destroyed our tent. During this, one of our bags had been sent flying towards us, crashing right next to me. Realizing it was my bag, I reached over and felt through the pockets before finding my car keys. This was our moment to escape. I whispered into Daniel's ear that when I gave the signal to run for the car as fast as he could, despite his distress, he nodded. A few moments after the creature started attacking our tent, a noise drew its attention off into the woods. It turned towards the sound, and that's when I told Daniel to run. We both rose to our feet and dashed towards our car. Deafening shriek filled the air behind us as we ran. Right before we made it, I rapidly clicked the unlock button, and we both entered the car, slamming and locking the doors behind us. I started the car, and when lights came on, that thing was standing right before us. An angry grin plastered across its elongated face. I threw the car into reverse, and we backed out of there. I spun the car around in the soft drift, and we drove the trail back onto the main road, trying desperately not to crash in the process. We didn't stop driving until we made it home. The entire drive, Daniel didn't say a word. He just sat there, sobbed quietly in his seat, while I struggled not to do the same. Since that day, I've decided to never take my son camping again. I woke up at 3 a.m. to an emergency alert notification on my phone. Struggling to find my phone, I turn on the lamp on my nightstand only to find it on the floor. The notification read, "Do not look at the moon. Please fall asleep and refrain from looking outside." I was a little freaked out by this. What could possibly be wrong with looking at the moon? I became even more confused when I found out I had over thousands of other notifications. My eyes grew wider and I awakened more. I unlocked my phone to find WhatsApp having a little red circle above it saying 99 plus. All of my social media apps had over 100 notifications. One of the notifications had said, "Look at the moon. It's beautiful outside." Must have been someone who had gotten the notification and wanted to creep someone out. That's when I found out another notification had said, "Look at the moon. It's beautiful outside." That's weird. Another person said the same thing. I scrolled through all the other notifications. To my surprise, it had all said the same thing. "Look at the moon. It's beautiful outside." I was freaked out. I wanted to look outside out of curiosity, but I was so creeped out I didn't. Maybe my phone was hacked. I decided to text my friend to see if he was in the same scenario as I was. However, when I opened up his DMs, all of the previous messages were gone, and there was only one thing on the screen. "Look at the moon. It's beautiful outside." I was bewildered. I had to be hacked, right? I texted him anyway. "Dude, what's going on? Did you get the emergency alert notification too?" About a minute later, he texted back, "Look at the moon. It's beautiful outside." That made me feel less like my phone was hacked. The emergency alert had told me to just fall back asleep, and so I did. Well, I didn't, but I tried to. I felt haunted from those notifications. I just couldn't sleep. Finally, I got another notification. "It's the moon thing, isn't it?" I mumbled under my breath. When I opened up my phone, I was surprised to see a notification from my other friend. We'll call him Dave. It wasn't the moon thing. It was him saying, "Hey, dude, you up?" I got a weird alert, and now thousands of people are texting me. My eyes grew, and I quickly sat up to text him back. "Yeah, you getting the moon thing too?" I texted quickly. He responded, "I haven't looked at the moon, have you?" I replied, "No, I don't want to, but I am curious though." He responded, "Don't look at it. I don't know what can happen, but it certainly can't be a good thing." I decided to turn on my lights and close the curtains just in case. "You know I'm a curious guy," I texted. "I feel like I have to." He kept telling me, "Don't look at it. It could be bad." He knows I'm a curious guy. I'm also a risky person, and usually The same could be said about him. However, this time, he was serious. What could possibly happen if I looked at it? I texted. It's not a joke, and I'm not kidding, he replied. I couldn't take it anymore. My curiosity was beaming. I turned off my phone. I set it down and I walked to the window. I opened the blinds. I peeked my head out and looked up. The moon was beautiful. A pretty blue and yellow color made it glow. It was almost rainbow-like. The moon was bigger and brighter than usual. It was the most beautiful thing I've seen in my life. My phone kept pinging. I walked to it with a huge grin and unfocused eyes. It was Dave, saying, "Dude, why aren't you responding? Did you look at the moon?" I responded, texting him back using nothing but my index finger. Key by key, I said, "Look at the moon. It's beautiful outside." Legend had it that an old man lived in the woods on the outskirts of town. No one had seen him in years, but there were stories about strange noises coming from his cabin at night. One day, a group of teenagers decided to go into the woods and find the old man's cabin. They thought it would be a fun adventure, but they had no idea what they were getting into. As they walked deeper into the woods, the trees grew thicker and the air grew colder. They could hear strange noises in the distance, and they began to feel as though they were being watched. Eventually, they came across the old man's cabin. It was dilapidated and covered in moss, with a rusty metal roof and a crooked chimney. They approached cautiously, not sure if the old man was still inside. When they entered the cabin, they saw that it was filled with strange artifacts. There were jars filled with oddities, bones and animal carcasses hanging from the ceiling. The air was thick with the smell of decay. Suddenly, they heard a creaking sound and the door slammed shut. They were trapped. They turned around to see the old man standing in the doorway, staring at them with hollow eyes. The old man was gaunt and pale, with a long beard and tattered clothes. He didn't say anything, but his presence alone was enough to terrify the teenagers. As they tried to run, they found that the cabin had transformed. The walls were covered in strange markings, and the floor was no longer leveled. They stumbled and fell, trying to find a way out. But the old man was always there, blocking their path. He would appear in unexpected places, his eyes following them wherever they went. He seemed to be toying with them, leading them deeper and deeper into the cabin. As time passed, the teenagers began to realize that they were not alone in the cabin. They could hear whispers and moans coming from the walls, and they felt as if something was trying to take over their minds. In the end, only one of the teenagers managed to escape. She stumbled out of the cabin, her eyes wild with terror. She was never the same after that day, always looking over her shoulder and jumping at every sound. The others were never seen again. Some say they were taken by the old man, while others say they were consumed by the darkness. But one thing was for certain: no one ever ventured to the man's cabin again.